Hello and welcome to Bolshevik Bistro on Eastern Marshlands YouTube channel, coming to you from Swamp to Stagnant Swamp. Check us out on easternmarshlands.com, and don't forget us to give us money on patreon.com/emlpodcast. Give us money, please give us money. Today with me is Pingu, a good friend of mine from Discord. He's a YouTube leftist shitposter. He's from the good old country of Sweden, and he has some strong opinions about the Danes. Hi, Pingu, and what do you think about the Danes?
They genocided us during the 1300s, and what I'm doing now as my political activity is to repay that.
Great. And today we're talking about nationalism. So, basically, this is a very interesting topic to talk about because, the reason why I decided to talk about this on Bolshevik Bistro is because I see a lot of reactionaries who could be easily a part of leftist movements, but they don't see any any of their grievances about their national identity or anything like that addressed by the left, and they easily seduced by right-wing, basically the right-wing populism, and they're like, hey, I better join this crazy reactionary party, and because this is the only way to protect my culture, which doesn't make sense for us leftists when we're like, wait a second, actually you can, but the question of is rarely addressed, at least from what I see, by the left, and rarely used by the left to get support. Like, what's your opinion on nationalism in general?
Well, it has a history of being reactionary, of course, and there's no way we can deny that. We have, especially in Europe, very strong nationalist tendencies throughout history, and we can see, looking at our history, even during the past 100 years, we can see that the most prominent form of reactionary nationalism has some grave consequences. Speaking, of course, of Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. However, before this came about, we also in Europe, especially in Ireland, we have another form of nationalism, which manifests itself through socialist action and through the liberation of Ireland from the British Empire. And I think, as you said earlier, you're spot on with the that we on the left don't address the question of nationalism as much as we should, in my opinion. I think that's because we're generally afraid of recreating the sort of reactionary tendencies that we have seen. And of course, I think that there's this risk exists even during a left nationalist movement, because even if maybe we should talk before we go into this, maybe we should lay out what left nationalism means.
What, nationalism or left nationalism, you said?
Yeah, if we can do that later on. Let's just talk about nationalism first, and maybe
let's talk about the history of nationalism, like how it came to be and what it is about. Because I think it's really important to look at nationalism from a historical standpoint and realize that actually nationalism has been a product of the when a lot of oppressed people, the imperial authority of people from other cultures and other even other continents, they have been starting to realize what they are and how they are different from others from national standpoint. This is when so-called national identity became a thing. It's like, look at Hungary, for example, or Poland. Those countries had a history of being under the rule of a foreign power, and they have been suppressed by those powers. And even before the Ireland, and all the stuff that was happening there, those people have been against the oppressors and creating this sort of this national identity. And it was always based on Enlightenment ideas and ideas of the freedom, equality, and liberty. And therefore, nationalism was an instrument of spreading those Enlightenment ideas. And this is why like civic nationalism exists. It's like a right for self-determination of people. And I believe if we look, like, when do you think the like reactionary right has started to like use nationalism for their own for their own interest? I think it was around the rise of fascism and proto-fascism.
Maybe.
It's like, look at it. Like, look, for example, death of like First World War ended the so much. It was the ending blow to the British Empire. It was a very important event for Europe that basically put the whole continent into this sort of weird, oh, everything is crumbling and everything is falling apart state. And with the rise of the left and international communism all over Europe and all of those revolutions, we had this sort of appearance of this thing that is often referred to as Bonapartism. It's the idea of it's authoritarian republicanism that uses bureaucracy and uses authoritative methods to maintain the status quo. And this slowly then was changed into what we now call fascism. It gave rise to fascism, like 100%, like Weimar Republic that elected a Bonapartist, and then he appointed Hitler as the chancellor. It's like all of this, how do I say it? All of this existential fear for oneself, for the country's self, has led to this, oh, we need to do something or we will all be destroyed and our heritage will be destroyed. And this is why the right wing used it to fuel the flames of hatred to the neighbors, to go to safeguard their own positions in their own countries. Yeah, but like, I'm sorry, I was almost like, I want one thing, because that's a lot of things to say, but also if you look at the like basically disappearance of national bourgeoisie as a class and the coming of the international bourgeoisie and international capital as being the main moving force behind everything, we see that this is why right wing has been so anti-globalist and why they have been so nationalist. You see this thing, like they have been saying, like Alex Jones is a great example. He's a nationalist. He is anti-globalist. It's like, yay, destroy the global capital. Let the our nationalism is under attack by the other. There's something else, the other somewhere there who is who's going to destroy everything that we stand for. Therefore, will become right-wing nationalists. And as Goulash Guy points out in the chat in the moment, the dictatorship has grown decadent. We need a strong democracy.
Yes.
Like, isn't it weird? Like like this relationship between right wing and nationalism. It's like, it's deeply existential, in my opinion. Don't you think?
Well, I think it's the one major thing which you can how do you say it, summon forth, maybe you could say,
Uh-huh.
in most people during a crisis of sorts, whether it's political or economical. Um, so, speaking of Alex Jones and America, we can see that uh, a lot of their jobs are getting offshored, and you have an unstable nation just to the south of them, Mexico, and they're getting a lot of immigrants from there who are taking shit jobs, and whereas the common American worker loses his job because of offshoring from his boss, who's
Mm-hmm.
capitalist, and the I think it was um, ever since the 80s in America, their real wages have remained stagnant. They haven't rose or shrunk at all.
Yeah, it's the
Um,
same.
and they're wondering why is this happening? Because before that, they had the golden age, and the real wages were rising so much. Um, so more and more jobs are getting lost. You have Mexican immigrants taking shit jobs, but it's jobs, and that's what people see. Uh, and they feel betrayed by their society, and this is what the right wing populists feed into, because they look back at the time where America was quote unquote great, and this is um, both what Alex Jones and Donald Trump were playing
Mm-hmm.
on,
Yeah. And
and
it's easy, it's really relatable. This is like why nationalism is so important, because it is one of those bases of the, like, because it appeared at the rise of nations and enlightenment, because enlightenment and liberalism are like, enlightenment, liberalism, and nationalism are all the things that are both a giant foundational stone on which all modern republicanism stands on,
mhm.
and is what is ingrained into our subconsciousness. This is like the
Of course,
point
that's
zero of the world understanding,
this is
basically.
like you might not be even be aware of it, even if you don't consider yourself patriot or nationalist or anything like that. You just see
Hmm.
yourself as a common human. But if you meet someone uh, who isn't from your country, and they ask you, "Who are you?" You
Hmm.
probably say, "Well, I'm from. I have this national identity, where it's Swedish or Belarusian or Italian." I think
Yeah.
that's one of the most common answers to that question. Um, so playing into this again is very strong to create popular movements, and in the case of America, it's very easy for them to play on specific ethnicity, because that
Hmm.
is uh, to the most part uh, it's very easy to identify who is who. Uh, so what I mean is, even though America has a very diverse population in comparison to Europe, when
Hmm.
it comes to skin color, um, they know what uh, quote a Mexican looks. I don't know how to say it
Yeah,
really.
it's like they still distinguish between different like versions of Americans.
Hmm.
They know exactly what and who they're talking to and about, and it's really like, if a guy, like, occasionally, like, still they still value heritage.
Hmm.
There are still people who still refer to themselves as uh like Mexican American, Anglo-Saxon,
Hmm.
and all of those people. They still distinguish. The difference with America is that those differences are so invisible, and race has become such a giant topic of discussion, and such a giant topic of it always has been a defining aspect of American socio-economic structures. Therefore, they are moving away from it, and this is why interesting new versions of nationalism are like rising. And this is like the thing that I wanted to talk about to you. The different versions, quote unquote, of nationalism on the right and on the left. And I'd love to
Mhm.
begin with the right wing. And before we go into it, I'd like to say thank you everybody who's in the chat. We see you. Cummings is saying Pingu is a filthy Mexican. Wake up, America. Dynamic Darren is saying that's always international Jews. Yes, they are, not the individual Jews. Please, there is a difference. And I'd like to say, share this out, send it to your buddies, subscribe to the channel, like the video. It really helps us. It helps us out a lot. And yeah, that's give us money, please give us money. As always, patreon.com/emlpodcast. And let's talk about white nationalism because it is one of the biggest one.
Yes, and I would consider this more an American thing, but it's getting in recent times. It has, of course, come to Europe as well. In more, yes, in more recent days. But
Yeah.
if you look at nationalism in Europe, before we have to go through to see why this happens. German nationalism. They weren't calling themselves really white. They call themselves Germans. Whereas the American white nationalists, they call themselves white. They don't call themselves well, I'm of well, they can say like in individuals, they say, well, my parents are from Ireland or Poland or whatever it could be.
They usually refer to the heritage as European heritage.
Yes,
they
that
teach everything else. They say like, I am European, like
yes,
meaning white.
And this goes into the I would say it's an American construct, the idea of pan-Europeanism, where they think that Europe is some sort of unified entity, and we relate to each other, and because of our skin color. But you and I both know as Europeans that this isn't true.
Yeah, it's not. It's really not. All we have in common, two things. It is hundreds of years of each other, and the second is a couple of 100 years of murdering Germans.
Yes.
Like, and that includes Germany murdering Germans. Like, the only way to unite Europe is to like unite us on the basis of hatred to Germany. That's the only thing.
Or just I think the only way to unite Europeans is their common hatred for another European.
But it's mostly Germany. It's mostly Germany. It is a common hatred to Germans.
I would say the post-Yugoslavian states and the Balkans. At least up here.
Yeah, it's all hatred to each other. Yeah, it's like it's only hate. It doesn't work like Americans think it does.
Yes.
Some people who claim that they identify as European first and everything else second, of any sort of, like, what is European identity? Say something about, oh, our common, and you're like, and they don't really specify, because if you look into history, it's just killing each other.
Yeah,
it's our the fact that it always worked before. Look at Austria-Hungary or Yugoslavia. It's like, no, it always finished terribly. Stop it.
Yeah.
And reconsider your socio-political stances, because there is no thing in there,
Yeah, it's just I would say it's just a desperate attempt to grasp for something to actually hold on to fight for in their how do you what would you call America? A cesspool, a hellhole, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
I think that's one of the few things they got, especially uh, since socialism, which
Oh, I'm sorry.
oh
Before you move on, remember where you are. I've just found out that the stream was unlisted this whole time.
oh
We have
damn.
people on who have the link. Oh my god, this is terrible. Okay, people will start joining in right now. That's all right. No biggie. I've unlisted it to only bro for pointing it out, and now people will start joining. Okay, so Pingu, please move on. I'm sorry.
I was saying that this is one of the few things that they have since the idea and discussion of socialism has been completely crushed
Uh
in
huh.
their country, especially
Yeah,
through
basically.
after the Great Depression and the Cold War, and it has just been too taboo to even use the word. It has been derogatory,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
but now in recent times it's getting back up, which I find very good. But what I mean to say is that socialism as a movement, as an idea, it unifies people into a movement. So if the socialist alternative, not making reference to the party, of course, um, um, the socialist alternative exists, then people have anything else to, they have something else to turn to when these dire situations arise, and not just reactionary nationalism.
Yeah, because I remember a lot of people refer to that, and I remember like ContraPoints talk about it. A lot of other people with whom I talked on Discord talked about it. That is what we call right-wing reactionarism and all aspects of it, like fascism, like Nazism, white nationalism, other kinds of those things, are
What even
deeply existential.
I would even consider liberal
You know?
conservatism uh, reactionary.
Yeah, yeah. In many ways, because if you look at the reasoning behind their policy, we are under attack to safeguard we need to protect. It's like in case of Nazis, protect the white race. In case of liberal conservatism, we need to protect our way of life.
Mm-hmm.
This is why they are anti-change, they're anti-immigration, they are pro like leaving everything as it is, like no changes, no whatsoever. Move on, blah blah blah. I can't hear you uh, over my liberal ideals or something. Deeply contradictory to what liberalism was originally about.
Mm-hmm.
It's still sort of, it in many ways it is still like autism. It's still an attempt to safeguard the republic at any cost. It means to lose reasons for that in the meantime. It doesn't matter if the democracy doesn't matter, or ideal republic is this is why this is why the Roman Republic, uh
Mm.
Roman Republic symbolism,
Yeah.
and they said that they are the end of liberalism. They refer to themselves as, because they said that liberalism is a dead ideology, and it us like um, a safe framework for acting our way of life. And
Mm-hmm.
in many ways, those fears exist only if you're deeply class, uh, if you have realize class relationship, and you realize your position in, uh, you do understand that there is another way to deal with it, and you recognize other dangers that are posed to you and your country and your people and stuff like that. Right wing doesn't have that. I believe they act in this way.
Hmm.
Like, this is why it's all about, oh no, we are going to disappear. Why genocide, you know?
Yeah, there's another core part in especially fascism, but this plays into the right wing sort of nationalism as well, because they fascists tend to view, or not even tend, they do view history as a struggle of nations, uh, whereas us leftists or socialists, we view history as a struggle of class. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say uh, liberals, they view history as a struggle of ideas. Uh, this
Yeah.
these distinctions have a very very how do you say it? They're very important to they make these tendencies of nationalism radically different from each other. Because I would say that the
Mm-hmm.
liberal version of, as you said earlier, the liberal version of nationalism is of course civic nationalism, um, and whereas the right wing one would be uh, ethnic or hardcore cultural nationalism, or even traditionalist. Um, um, whereas the left wing one would be um, how do you say it would be anti-imperialist, and it would view national liberation as something that you only can do through socialism, because
Mm-hmm.
um, I think the right wing ones, they deceive people that they will be free if this supposed threat goes away. So it could be black people, or it could be Jews, or it could be Serbs or Bosnians or whatever. Um, but this never happened, of course, because they still support the same structures that, um, to use Marxist terms, bourgeois society still has, which would be
Yeah.
the bureaucracy and capitalism and markets, and the social isolation and the bastardization of culture. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the the left wing nationalists, we view we do not only want anti-imperialism, of course, uh, and um, our national liberation. We realize that national liberation of the people and nationalism is the liberation of a people, but it doesn't mean of all of the classes. Just,
Mm-hmm.
and if you truly, if I may spout some ideology, if you truly care about your people, then you would be anti-capitalist and as such left-wing nationalist, uh, because there's no reason that the life of your countrymen won't be any different if the capitalist is Chinese or of your own national identity in your own country,
Yeah.
because uh, you will still be crushed and suppressed by the structures of capitalism and bourgeois democracy, if you even have that. Uh, so that's why uh, the only form of national liberation is through socialism, through elimination of class society, and through democracy.
Yeah. I agree. And I'd like to point out that despite the fact that I don't really associate that deeply with the Belarus, I don't really think that I do have, at least I don't have a very strong connection to my Belarusian identity. But still, I'd like to point out that uh, like Belarus exists today only because of Soviet Union, only because of socialism. And I'd like to tell a little story of how it all works. Basically, Belarus is one of the biggest examples, because when liberals start to hate on Belarusian liberals start to hate on communists, and all of them are civic nationalists because of like current president's unwillingness to give a lot of freedom to Belarusian language. He doesn't have any policy that supports the language, and it is slowly dying and becomes the language of of obscure villages and liberals from the city, basically. They still like hate on communists because they see it as like a symbol of Russian imperialism. And this is what Soviet Union has always been seen by many like liberals and many non-liberals, but like people in general, young people mostly, as the product of Russian imperialism, nothing else. But if you really look into history of Belarusian language and culture, you do realize that without the communists, we wouldn't exist as a people. We would be Russians. And a quick reminder.
You want to sit here and say that I'm a goddamn fucking Russian? You get in my face with that, I'll beat your goddamn ass, you son of a bitch.
I may not have a connection to Belarus, but I'm not Russian. Fuck off. Thanks to communists. So, what happened in the end of 19th century? Belarus is a giant fucking field with like southwestern and northeastern dialects of Belarusian language. The land is called Belarus, but not really. There was no liberal movement. There was no enlightenment, that was happening here, because all of the attempts of spreading enlightenment ideas were crushed by Russian Empire. All the universities were closed, and it was basically an agricultural region that just existed. People in Belarus referred to themselves as people from here, literally, like in quotations. We are locals. This is what they said. Like you said, like when somebody asks you, who are you? You say, I am Swedish, I'm Italian, and Belarusian. People said, I am local. So you do realize there is nothing that would, indicate any sort of level of identifying as a nation. And what happened next is that when communists came, they created a state that was called Belarusian Soviet Republic. And in this country, there were 4 languages, official state languages. Those include Russian, Polish, Yiddish, and Belarusian. The Belarusian language itself was created by the communists as an attempt to combine the southwestern and northeastern dialects into one language. They created books, and they created the high language, basically the language of literature and of state officials. The language was taught everywhere, and by the 1927, I think 90% of the government was using Belarusian as the language, and most of the people most Belarusians were using Belarusian as their language, and this was done with the communists. Like, obviously, in 1927, about 100 people of like prominent cultural figures were shot, and the whole thing quickly finished, and then Russian became the main language, and everything sort of finished. Thank you, Daddy Stalin. But I digress. What Bolsheviks did before Stalin is that they created 30 written languages for nations of the far north that didn't have a written language, which provided them with an ability to safeguard their culture and their heritage for years to come. Like, and I'm saying all of that because you should realize that capitalism is not in the cultural preservation, prosperity of the people game. It's in profits game. And socialism, on the other hand, it's one of its tasks is to preserve as much as possible, is to value things on not on profits basis, but on needs basis, and people need that, and therefore it gives it them. And so, like, and if I don't really know the history of Ukraine, but I'm pretty sure Ukraine had a similar story with them, that Ukrainian language wasn't really a big deal for Russian Empire. They didn't really care that much, and therefore the culture was also in a state of meh, you know, really underground, really suppressed, really not really supported, you know. And I believe that left wing provides a far better framework for actual, you know, self-realization of the people, self-organization of the people on the socialist, using a socialist platform to provide them with safe haven of their culture, their heritage, and further advancements of them. This is one of the important things. Like, they all say about saving the heritage, but what about creating something new with it? If it is not profitable, it won't happen in capitalism. And I don't think, like, for example, Russian Empire was really interested in Belarusian literature, to be honest. Like, this is another point. People didn't know how to read, therefore only a small minority of, like, the majority of the people who could read in Russian were Russian rich people. And they didn't really care about all of those, you know, fairy tales of Belarusian peasants, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying, Pingu? I'm sorry, I was talking for too much, but I was telling a little story and explaining that. I'm sorry if I went on for too long.
I'm sorry, but I had a hard time following all of it,
but yeah, basically, Belarusian and Ukrainian culture were created because of socialism,
mm-hmm.
and only socialism gives a platform for saving the culture from destruction, and gives a platform for the culture to prosper, because it doesn't need to be profitable in socialism to be created. Therefore, culture can exist without money, without necessity for profits.
Yes.
So this is what I'm short in a short form.
Yes, this is a thing you mentioned earlier, which I think is very important when we talk about the leftist form, which Connolly wrote about as well.
Let's talk about Ireland. Let's talk about Connolly and Ireland.
Yes. So
yeah,
the thing I wanted to say that Connolly mentioned, which you also mentioned, is he said that we must not, as in him saying this, the Irish, must not just be self-absorbed by their history as Irishmen, but rather we must be self-realized as people and continue to producing and continue to creating our own identity and our own culture. So I think this is also a huge difference from the right-wing form of nationalism, because they only revel in the history and the glories of the past, whereas Connolly says that you can do that as well, and I'm sure, and that there are good examples which of the history of the people which could be glorified and should be looked upon as such, but we mustn't stop there.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, capitalism is not the best way to do it, because if you have, like, nobody wants to, like, in Russian Empire, as I said, nobody would want to read a book written for Belarusians by Belarusians, because Belarusians couldn't read, therefore there is no market for that, you know. Therefore, it won't be created. And but it's really, I know that people can read now, but I'm just using this as an example of how culture could be suppressed in a capitalist environment and how it can be destroyed and forgotten. Not only that, look at America and look at Native Americans. Like, Native American tribes have been suppressed for generations, massacred like so many years ago, and they still suffer because of capitalism, and their culture is dying mostly because all of their people are dying. It's like per capita, like they basically they still are one of the most suppressed people, the privileged people in America. If I recall correctly, if you look per capita, Native American women are like the most sexually abused, and they suffer from most sexual harassment and rape compared to other demographics per capita. So we really see that it's really fucked up, and the whole people are just destroyed because they're not as important. And it's not a thing that socialists really like, to do or to support. This is exactly the reason why left-wing liberation movements are a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, look at, for example, Hungary. If I recall correctly, one of the biggest demographics for Trotskyist's party are Roma people who are oppressed by Hungarian politicians and that suffer from racial discrimination. Like, they are the ones who go to socialist parties and enlist.
Mm-hmm.
Because they realize that the money is the power, not some abstract family, like not an abstract idea from where your family originates and what you look like or what your native language sounds like,
Yes.
But let's talk about Connolly a bit, because we already mentioned him more than once. Can you please tell us who he is, what happened in, was it 1918, right? The uprising?
No, the Easter uprising.
Yeah,
Easter uprising was 1916.
1916, right. Can you tell us who Connolly was, what happened, and why is he an important figure for left wing today if we want to talk about nationalism?
Mm-hmm. James Connolly was a Scots-born Irishman who is a very important person to socialist and Marxist history and also national liberation history. He was one of the founding members of the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World.
Yep.
And he was closely related to American Marxism and American socialism, along with Eugene Debs and Daniel De Leon. He, how do you say it? His earlier works are about Irish nationalism and how it connects to socialism. And he talked about what we have talked about as well, but in a much better and clearer way. So I recommend you to read his earlier works, Socialism and Nationalism, Socialism and Irish Nationalism, I think it's called, and Patriotism and Labor. Very good pieces on this. He was part of the Sinn Féin movement, which was the Irish republicanism movement. Or rather, he was associated with a lot of different organizations in Ireland.
Yeah.
One of them being, and the Sinn Féin movement was just a national liberation movement. But his main association would be the what was it called? Socialist Irish Republican Party. Which and the Sinn Féin movement fought against British imperialism and as well as capitalism. He was, of course, a revolutionary as a Marxist, and he was a prominent leader in Ireland, and even and how do you say it? Even he after the Easter uprising, after combat, when the Ireland had where the Irishmen had fights with the British Empire, who occupied their land. He was wounded and captured, and then later on executed by the British. And even and he was such a strong figure to the Irishmen. Even people who didn't really care or support their socialist struggle, even after his execution, all of the Irishmen were really, really upset about his death and that the British killed him. And so, not only is he important to socialist history and national liberation history, but he's also very important to the Irish people. So that's James Connolly. I can't sum up his life anymore.
Yeah, but like he's everything that one man can dream of being, when he's in politics. He is a prominent writer, theorist, member of so many political movements,
Even Lenin looked up to him.
Yeah. Like he was a national hero, beloved by everyone, martyr of a revolution, to end it all up. Like it's really crazy. And he's just an example of not only he's an example of a great socialist, but a great revolutionary, but also a great nationalist, because it was about liberation of Ireland, and he talked about Ireland, and really I believe that he's one of those examples, like especially in the fact that you mentioned that he is beloved across the aisle, by both right wing, left wing, everyone,
the Emerald Isle, as they call it.
Yeah, basically, and it just shows you that we can we can address the questions of nations and questions of national liberation without right-wing populism, without right-wing nationalism. There are other ways to do it, and we can give people nationalism through a nationalist standpoint, which will still be nationalism, which still will be socialism, right? And it is a way to get people on our side, because we literally have a better way to deal with that shit, And yes, in my opinion, personally, we do have a better way to do it. And I think he's just a great example of how to do those things right, how to frame. And he wrote so many literature. I was looking through it. I didn't read enough, I really want to dwell more into Connolly and look into what he was talking about, because in my opinion, we already talked. Yeah, he was saying, talking about what we have been talking about, that capitalism just gives, if you want to liberate the people, but you don't destroy capitalism, you retain the framework of oppression, so it doesn't really make sense.
No, there's no real difference in it. We can point to historical examples of this happening. We can say, well, what happened to the working man? Well, nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing changed. It's like, yes, that's great. We liberated our people. Now my governor is now Irish and not British. Yay. Like, what is the difference? It's like a lot of people are saying that, like, why ultimately Soviet Union failed is because they had a giant problem with the fact that they used the Russian imperial system they basically, when they took over, they used the imperial system to deal with stuff, creates a state with it. And when you create a state using a particular set of instruments, it not to sound completely retarded, but it looks like it takes a similar shape of what it used to be. You know, I'm not saying Russian or Soviet Union was imperialist, but like it uses, if you use the infrastructure that was before you, your state will resemble what it was before. You know,
Hmm.
you know what I'm saying, or it doesn't make sense.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but like this is ultimately why capitalism has to go, because if you use capitalism, you literally have the same stuff, no changes whatsoever, nothing.
Because what we're doing is structuralist analysis, uh,
Exactly.
and that the people in charge, the people playing the governing parts of the machine, if you would call it, they're how do you say it? Almost they're some aspects of their characters, such as race or sexuality.
Mhm.
They don't matter in the structure, because like you don't your boss at your workplace isn't somehow forcing his sexuality upon you or something like that.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
this is
I
a
do
pure
understand.
material analysis, but also structuralist, which that in itself isn't material, but an egoist would call it spooks,
Mhm.
merely socially constructed. But these social constructs are, of course, enforced through material means, such as the police force.
Right. And there was one thing that I really wanted to talk to you about, which
Hmm.
could be, we already have been doing it for almost an hour. I think we already had an hour past. But
It's
there was one thing that I'd love to talk to you about, is the the differences between what we call nation and what we call ethnos. Because um, we have a thing, like we have this thing called ethno nationalism, right?
hmm
But from if you really look at those as at the things that we call if you really look at the definitions of ethnos and nation, you can find a contradiction there, because usually how we look at usually the like mainstream outlook on the word on those definitions are that ethnos is a lower stage of nation. It's like first a nation is an ethnos, which is defined by um, and group identity of people who live in a particular land, have particular look like each other, who speak a same language, and they have shared history and shared culture,
hmm
and then it transcends into what we call a nation. Um, and if you look at the nation and what nation is about, it's usually defined as this ethnos that has authoritarian structures, such as religion, state, that enforces itself onto people. Like basically, um, structure. It is a social structure that is created on top of ethnos. Therefore, it
hmm
becomes more important than the ethnos itself. But if you look at some particular um, nationalists, you do realize that those people are not really talking about our great golden ages of our grand land when they usually refer to, you know, to the great state, like when our country was great, this sort of, like for example, Trump, who appeals to those people by saying like, make America great again, let's go back to the time when our country was great, not our people, but our country.
hmm
You see?
Yes.
Look at Varg. Like we must talk about Varg. Varg is not talking about that. He's not talking about hey, Sweden, yay. No, he's not. He's talking about Norse culture. He's talking about paganism. He's talking about those things, what we could really describe not as nationalism, but as like ethno something. No, as because it's not nationalism. It's ethnocism. Ethnocism.
Ethnocentrism, perhaps.
Yeah, ethnocentrism. Maybe it's like when you put this thing on as on the first part, not the societal structure. And maybe this is a way to go with Pingu in Europe. What do you think about that? Do you think it's fair to separate those things as nation and ethnos?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I don't think when we look at the term of ethno-nationalism today, of course, as you pointed out earlier, the etymology of the words don't really matter anymore. They have evolved.
Mhm.
But of course, I don't think ethnicity matters to nationalism. It's I would consider ethno-nationalism the worst kind of nationalism because it can be formed and molded in any way you want to. For example, you could in Europe you could say, well, us Germanics, we're the big ones, and we need the big state going through north to middle Europe, and Slavs and Latin people and Hispanics and Anglos and the Celtic get out, and everyone else who isn't from Europe, we don't want you either. But again, you could also form this ethno-nationalism as sort of a pan-nationalism, and this is what they do in America again, because they only talk about the whiteness of your skin. And even if you talk about the whiteness of your skin, even that can be formed and molded to where it fits your agenda, where it fits you. Because as we know, they're not just all white people don't have the exact same skin tone, and some are more tan than others. But to some people, they are regarded as white, and to some people, they're not. So, for example, Spaniards and Italians and Greek people, some people regard them as white, others do not. Do you see what I mean here?
Right. It's really like, I think it's a problem with right-wing nationalism, especially with nationalism, in general. This is why I don't really consider myself to be a nationalist. Like, those things can easily be shaped in whatever way possible. It's like when they're based on a passport, on your place of origin, like with civic nationalism. It's like, if you're born in Sweden, you're Swedish. Yay! Let's develop a common identity based on our borders. It's easier. It's really easier to frame it. In other forms of nationalism, which are based on two things: self-identity and acceptance in a group. Group accepting you as being one of them is really.
It's very esoteric.
Yes, and very shaky. And it's really the reason why states, like an attempt to create so-called pure states, ultimately fails, because you can't account for everything in this regard. You can't really you can't really account for different outlooks on the same term. It's like, what does it mean if we create a Cascadian ethno-state, right? What does it mean to be a Cascadian?
Yeah.
Does it mean you have to be this and that? Do you have to be white? Do you have to be of a particular origin? Does it only occurs to, like, is it only for Anglo-Saxons who live in Cascadia? Or you don't have to be a Cascadian to be a Cascadian. Like you do. It's really crazy. It's really silly.
Yeah,
really esoteric.
It's just pure idealism. Uh, not to do a she shake, but it's pure idealism, and it's just esoteric nonsense. There's no real structural basis of it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and somebody's in chat is saying about Inuit nationalism. It's one of those things. What does it mean to be an Inuit?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it only about Russian Inuits, or is it about Canadian ones? Do they have differences in culture? Do they have genetic differences? You know, and how do we determine that? Do they have? And how do we create such a state? Like, I believe if we really, really have to do something with it, we really have to go back. I think that if we really base it on not on your skin color or your place of origin, but rather the locality where you reside is a way to do it. Like, if you look at Soviet Union and the development of different local identities, which is very interesting. Like, people started to identify, because they all lived in one giant country, they started to identify as people who obviously who live in a particular Soviet republic, but also as people from a particular part of the Soviet republic. Um, I really can't say, because obviously it happens in every big country, but and then even in some small countries. But in Soviet Union, the interesting part about that is that local culture started to develop. Uh, Basically, a person from a particular city who's started to, some people started to get interested in the history of their locality, and they started to walk around researching their own towns, their own villages, and their own regions, and they started to, create local museums of local culture, local history, and those local historians play a giant part, and those, local museums played a giant part in research of history of basically what we now call as ex-Soviet Union. Those people related to the place of the place where they lived, and they created culture based on their place of origin. They had their own traditions. They had their own ways to um, basically, literally, they had communal culture that was based
Yeah.
on where they live.
Yes, this happens everywhere as humans, wherever humans roam. You have this overarching identity of through culture in let's say a federation and or a county or whatever, to an approximate, of course, because people
Right.
don't adhere to imaginary borders. Um, then within these you have villages and towns and cities and whatnot, and within these places you create sort of microcultures, which are sort of sprouts or saplings from from the original, well, not the original one, but the overarching one. So they're going to be like micro differences. So so like in let's say you have a tradition where you I don't know. Let's take the Swedish way to celebrate Midsummer's Eve. You dance around a grass and flower clad penis,
Right.
and you sing about small frogs. So
Frogs?
yeah, you sing about small frogs.
This is cute as fuck.
That's how we do it. It's an old fertility rite, pre-Christian.
Nice.
Which still lives on today, which is pretty impressive.
Cool.
So let's say this is the overarching one, and people feast on maybe potatoes and fish, just for example, just potatoes and fish. And then
Okay.
in the same in another village, but in the same federation or council, they do the same penis dance, but they feast on maybe pork and spaghetti. And
Okay.
and maybe they have a different accent as well, because that's how humans develop. Even birds do this. They develop different accents and dialects. So
Excellent. This is crazy. I've learned about that. I think from you.
yes,
You talked about that. It's crazy.
I mentioned it the other day.
Yeah, I remember that.
So even if you have this strong idea to have a cultural identity, you're gonna still have. I don't want to use the word deviant because that's derogatory, but saplings or sprouts maybe, which arises naturally through how humans interact. We develop different accents and dialects just by being around people.
Yeah.
So all of these. What was the original point you made? I can't even remember.
The original point is that I think that we should really think about not even think, but dedicate more attention to local cultures, communal culture, as being one of the basis of cultural identity. Like this is the way to do it, you know.
But
that is deeply connected not on national, you know, level, but on ethnic level, like on basis of culture, like, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I wouldn't call it ethnos. That rings a bad bell. But
okay,
I think just local culture is a good term, and I think that's. I think we accept that more than we might think now when we're bringing it up, and like people in general do it, and they accept others. Like, for example, I know, for example, people here, they accept the culture in Gothenburg, and I live on the east side of the country. Gothenburg is on the west coast. Like, we still regard each other as Swedish, of course, but we have our minor differences in culture, and that's no problem, of course. And the point I was making before was that even if we try to structure it, that's not even going to happen because of how humans work through nature, by developing accents and dialects and different ways to express our own collective identity.
Right. And I believe that this is one of those things that the right wing forgets, you know, and I think this is a great way to finish it all off, to bring it back to Connolly, what he said that you mentioned, that the right wing idealizes the past of a nation and the culture, and we shouldn't just, you know, live in the past, but we also should create. We also should create new while also idealizing the past. And I really believe that Conley was right in this regard, and that we really should we shouldn't forget that people care about those things. And if you care about those things, you should realize that left-wing politics is the way for the best way to safeguard the culture. And is there anything else that you'd like to say, Pingu, before we go away?
Well, maybe I don't know.
I can say for you, go and subscribe to Pingu's channel on YouTube and make him make more videos, because his videos are fun as fuck. He does some nice shit posting, link is in the description. And before we maybe you can ask your opinions on the Norwegians.
On the Norwegians?
Yeah, what do you think about Norwegians?
They speak funny.
Okay. On this note, we say bye-bye to everyone, and thank you, Pingu, for participating. I was glad that you came on. It was
Thank you
fun
for having
talking
me.
about those things. And now we will go to our Discord, I think. You can see the link in the description. Please, people, check descriptions because we have a bunch of stuff there, which is like very cool, like Twitter accounts, links. Occasionally, post links to particular, different interesting websites or fundraisers. And please look at them. Don't forget to click a like, click a subscribe, and share this video on your Twitter or Facebook in your favorite Facebook Lefty group, for example. Why don't you do that? You can help. If you do it will help us like tremendously. And participate in the discussion in the description. All right, people. Thank you very, very much for listening. Radio Silence out.